having me today to present this work. I'm going to be going through the highlights, I guess, of my master's thesis project, as well as to thank you for helping fund this work to get me through my master's. Like Brian said, I'm going to be presenting the work I've done here for you today about drivers of productivity of montane and boreal breeding ducks. Okay, so as global climate continues to change, there is much interest in understanding how this will affect wildlife populations. And large-scale studies have demonstrated that there is an influence of climate on duck productivity and populations. But climate is expected to increase local weather variability, and so it's important to understand how this will affect duck populations at a local level so that we can understand the mechanisms driving these large-scale changes. Density dependence is also an ongoing subject in waterfowl research, and again, there is evidence for large-scale density-dependent regulations on waterfowl populations. And some local level studies have shown that duckling survival may be negatively related to local brood densities. And so the question kind of still remains, how do density dependent mechanisms regulate waterfowl populations? And there is a need to continue more of these small scale studies to understand this. So I've kind of already mentioned productivity, and so we're talking about the production of young and their recruitment into the breeding population, as this is key to waterfowl population growth. And so productivity encompasses a lot of small vital rates. I've just put a few here on this diagram to get an idea of what we're talking about. So right from the number of adults present on the breeding grounds to breeding propensity, and then we're talking about nesting and success, duckling survival, and then post-fledgling survival into the breeding season. So recruitment meaning when ducklings then enter as breeders themselves into the population. And so for the purposes of my research, I looked at different indices as a metric of productivity. So you'll hear me kind of throw around the word productivity a lot, and then when we get to the nitty-gritty, I'll kind of give more details of what I use to indicate productivity. But yeah, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about there. So lesser Scaup went through a decline in the 80s and 90s here, and they have not fully recovered and stabilized to their population goals, so they remain a species of conservation concern. And population modeling has revealed that during this period, low productivity can account for this decrease in population and not harvest mortality nor adult female survival. And so it's going to be important to understand what drives Scaup productivity if we're to recover and stabilize this population. Just to talk quickly about the Western Boreal Forest. So in Canada, it's this area highlighted in purple in this map. And it's known as North America's bird nursery because a large proportion of breeding birds, migratory breeding birds, breed in this biome, including about 67% of the lesser Scaup population. But relative to the prairie region, this area, the birds in this area, breeding in this area, have been not studied very much. And so there is a need to conduct more research in the boreal. So the broad question of my thesis work was, what are the drivers of productivity of lesser Scaup and other species, and how do these factors vary temporally? And so I wanted to investigate 4 main hypotheses at small spatial scales to get a better resolution for the mechanisms influencing productivity at the local level. And in the next few slides here, I'm just going to go through each of those 4 hypotheses and the general predictions I had for each of them. So the first is the spring phenology hypothesis. And so that predicts that the early onset of spring conditions may disconnect the optimal timing of breeding of ducks from their prey availability at the time of peak hatch. So basically that's just to say that we assume that right now in the given climate, you know, birds are laying their nests, and then they're timing the hatching of their young, maybe in accordance with when the peak of the prey hatch is. Ducks feed on invertebrates, lesser Scaup do anyway. So the idea is that with climate change, if spring is advancing, generally, there may be a disconnect. If those prey items are tracking that change and the ducks are not, there may be a disconnect between when those ducklings are hatching and when that prey is available, so they may have missed it. And so for Scaup, because they're a late nesting species, there may be a more of a risk for them to have this disconnect. So I would predict that if spring phenology hypothesis is at play, that the productivity will be lower in years with early onset of spring conditions. Second is the local weather hypothesis. So again, with climate change, we're expecting a lot more variability in local weather conditions, and that might mean that we have more cold weather events in the spring. And so I predict that in cold, wet local weather conditions in the spring and summer would negatively affect duckling production. And the third hypothesis, the density dependence hypothesis. So reproductive success would be negatively related to pair or brood density as the local population reaches the carrying capacity of the habitat. And the fourth is the alternate prey hypothesis. So when the ratio of staple prey to predators is high, so meaning the generalist predator and the staple prey we're going to talk about here is small mammals. So when it is high, the predators will prey mostly on their preferred staple prey. But when the ratio is low, so when this is depleted, then the predators will switch to an alternate prey source. And in this case, we're going to say that's waterfowl. So then I would predict that duck productivity would be lower in years of low abundance of staple prey. Okay, so to test these hypotheses, I conducted work. I used long-term data from 2 sites in the Scaup breeding range on either end, so in different habitats. So we had 1 boreal site and 1 montane site. So the first site is Lower Lake at Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge in southern Montana. And so at this site, we conducted nest surveys. So we had monitored nests, and then we web tagged ducklings at the nest on hatch date. And then we did some subsequent banding drives in August and September. And so at each occasion, the ducklings were marked, weighed, and measured. And so I had 9 years of these data to work with. And so from ducklings that were caught at the nest and then caught later, I had an exact age for them, and I was able to make a predictive model to estimate the age of all the ducklings in my data set. And so then I used an age-adjusted duckling body mass as a metric of duckling quality. And this is what in this chapter, I'm using as a metric of productivity, is duckling quality in proxied by age-adjusted body mass. So this is just to show, we have duckling mass here, on the y-axis and year on the x. So this is just to show that we did have variability in the mean duckling body mass from year to year. So the August driving trap is shown in gray and the September in blue. So obviously ducklings grow, so all the August ones are a lot lower, and September a lot higher. But this is just to show that year to year we do see there's some variability in the duckling mass. And so then I related this age-adjusted body mass of lesser Scaup ducklings to spring phenology, local weather conditions, and duckling density using general linear models within a model selection framework. At the second site, the Yellowknife study area in just north of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. So this is my boreal breeding site, which comprises of 575 study ponds. And so every season, we conducted 2 surveys in the spring to count waterfowl breeding pairs and 2 surveys to count waterfowl broods. And I had 26 years of these survey data to use there. I also had some small mammal and generalist predator data from the Northwest Territories to use as well. So I did look at all 6 of these species in these analyses, but today, for the sake of time, we're just going to look at the results for lesser Scaup because we don't have time to go through everybody. But I did want to point out that through this time series for all species, we did see a good amount of variability. So the solid black line is the count of breeding pairs, and the dotted line is the count of broods. And so, yeah, we do have a nice amount of variation through that 26-year time series. The dotted line just indicates where the survey started to become every other year. And so that did kind of, change things a bit, but we still use the full data set. And so I related brood counts as my metric of productivity to spring phenology, local weather conditions, pair density, and indices of prey and predator abundance using generalized linear models with a Poisson error structure because this is count data. Okay, so now we're going to go through the results, and I'm going to present the results per hypotheses and then look at each site. So what's important to kind of just remember, there's a lot of graphs, but what is on the y-axis of all these graphs is the metric of productivity, and then what's on the x is whatever metric or index I used to test that particular hypothesis. I'll try my best to orientate you throughout. So the first thing we're looking at here is the results for my Montaigne site for spring phenology. And so if the spring phenology hypothesis was completely at play, we would expect a negative relationship between duckling body mass and spring phenology index. Just to note, this is going from late spring to early spring. And we do kind of see that here. So there might be some evidence of advancing spring negatively affecting duckling quality. But we also see, this trend here. So late spring may be also disadvantage to duckling quality, because ducklings might be being born into cold weather. They thermoregulate pretty poorly in their first few days of life. There might be not enough time for the growth of vegetation, so there might not be a lot of cover, etc. So what this result is really showing is that there is like a sweet spot of the timing of spring and how that influences duckling quality at this site. At the same site, looking at local temperature in the spring and summer, again, we have this predicted duckling body mass on the Y, and these are just 2 indices of temperature in the pre-breeding and brood rearing periods. And we see this kind of like positive linear relationship, which is what you would expect, if warmer temperatures are advantageous to ducklings. So that is kind of what you expect, a slight relationship, but nevertheless it's there. And we find the same thing for the boreal site. So now this is predicted number of broods on the Y. That's the metric of productivity. And we see the same thing, the slight linear relationship with pre-breeding weather. So the nice warmer it is in that pre-breeding period, the better it is for the production of young. And I guess to note here on this slide, for spring phenology, I don't have a graph because I found no relationship between the predicted number of broods and my spring phenology index, though it was pretty much the same index I used at the Montaigne site. So yeah, no evidence here for that. Okay, and then the next hypothesis was the density dependence hypothesis. So at my Montaigne site here, back to this predicted duckling body mass on the Y, see a pretty strong negative relationship between duckling body mass and duckling density on the wetland. So this is I maybe didn't specify, this is about a 5-hectare wetland complex, this site, and so ducks do tend to move around to use kind of the same areas once the ducklings are feeding, you know, throughout their brood rearing season. And so, yeah, there is some evidence here that there might be some density dependent factors at play in regulating duckling quality when there's a high number of conspecifics on the wetland. So for my boreal site, the interpretation of the graph is a little bit different. So what we would expect is if there was no density dependence at play, we would expect a 1-to-1 ratio between the number of broods on counted and the number of indicated breeding pairs. Because this is a Poisson model, a 1-to-1 ratio in this case would be an estimate of 0.25. But given this estimate and this confidence interval, this relationship doesn't deviate much from that. And so there was no real evidence of any kind of density dependence going on in terms of the number of breeding pairs on the site regulating the predicted number of broods, at least for Scaup. Okay, and then the final hypothesis was this predator-prey relationship. So I have a few slides here. I only tested this at my boreal site. So this was, again, the predicted number of broods, and then this is my index of small mammals in the area. So just increasing density of small mammals. And so if the alternate prey hypothesis was at play, we would expect a positive linear relationship. And so we don't see any strong evidence of that effect, but I think it was important to include this because we do see some kind of signal relationship going on here, that there is a relationship between the number of broods and the number of small mammals in the area, but obviously it does merit some further investigation because we just kind of see this weak quadratic effect. However, we do see a pretty nice negative linear relationship between the predicted number of broods and the density of hares in the area. And so this might indicate some prey sharing going on. So hare are known to be a pretty staple prey item in these northern regions, particularly for lynx. And so on the next slide here, I've mapped out, so this is just a scaled index, and so by year, I have the lynx pelts per trapper. This was my metric for lynx in the purple line, and then I plotted hares per hectare on a 2-year time lag in this blue line here, and you can see it. I mean, it tracks pretty well. So, you know, lynx are eating hare, and the more hare there are, you know, 2 years later, the more lynx there are. So then it's not surprising that we see that a predicted number of broods, you know, does decrease with an increased lynx per trapper index. So, yep, lynx probably eat ducks, and the more hare there are, they're eating everybody. Okay, so just to kind of now summarize and digest everything I just went through. So by hypotheses, so for local weather, there is evidence from both sites that there's a slight effect there, that Scaup productivity is slightly favorable in warmer spring and summer conditions, as I expected. For spring phenology, at my Montaigne site, there seems to be a favorable intermediate onset of spring conditions, at least for these particular Scaup. I didn't find any evidence of this in my boreal site. For density dependence, there was evidence of lower duckling body mass in years of higher duckling density. And this is consistent with the other findings at this site from Mesmer and all, that there is some consequences of first-year survival with increased duckling density. But yeah, there was no indication of a negative relationship of pair density on brood counts at my boreal site. And so maybe this kind of merits some further investigation, and maybe considering a different metric for density at that site. And then finally, there was some evidence of prey sharing and general relationships between duck productivity and the local mammal and predator populations. Okay, so there's a lot of people to thank that got this research off the ground and together, and field work and collaboration, etc. So first of all, my supervisor, Dr. Bob Clark, who fantastically took me on in the last second of his career. And also thank you to my committee members, all the folks at Environment Canada in both the Saskatoon and Yellowknife offices, and then my collaborators at Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Area, and then to all my lab mates and friends at ECCC Saskatoon. And then obviously we would not be able to do any of this without everyone, all these agencies here who helped fund this project. Okay, and now I will take questions.